So let me start. I think we're a little bit into the hour. So let me start by introducing in absentia our first speaker, Ms. Claudia Contreras, who is an Economic Affairs Officer at the Trade Environment and Sustainable Development branch of UNCTAD. As an economist, she has more than 15 years of experience in sustainable development and science, technology, and innovation policy. Before working on trade and environment issues, Claudia was a member of the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on Science and Technology for Development. At the beginning of her career, she worked on innovation policy for the Chilean Economic Development Agency and Chile's National Commission for Scientific and Technological Research. She holds a BSc in economics from the University of Chile and graduated with an MSc in management research and a PhD in development studies from the University of Oxford. So as I mentioned, Claudia and David are not able to give a live presentation, but she was able to record a video in advance, after which I'll play a short video from UNCTAD about what they are doing as an institution, looking at the trade and blue economy sort of intersection. So we have a video. If we can get that video to play, we can get started.
Good morning. Thank you, Jan, for having me today in this training. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Greeting from Geneva. My name is Claudia Contreras. I'm Economic Affairs Officer at UNCTAD. My colleague, David Vivas, couldn't make it today, so it's just going to be me. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about how we elaborated our oceans economy trade strategies as part of our technical cooperation programs. As a general framework at UNCTAD, we contribute to the implementation of SDG 14, conserve and sustainable use of oceans, seas, and marine resources. On the screen, you can see the relevant targets of this goal that UNCTAD contributes. These include reduce marine pollution, regulate IUU fishing, prohibit certain forms of subsidies, increasing the economic benefits to seeds and coastal developing countries, increase scientific knowledge, and support small fisheries. In practical terms, we support developing countries in three main areas: dialogue and consensus building, policy-oriented research, and technical assistance and capacity building. So the OETS project was part of our technical capacity activities that we do with countries. The strategy is the OETS project. Is a project that started in 2018 and is in practice just finalized last week. The project benefited Barbados, Belize, and Costa Rica. These three countries are middle-income countries, and Barbados is also considered as by UNCTAD as a small island and developing state. The project aimed at assisting these countries in building competitive and sustainable managed ocean value chain within ocean affairs and the law of the sea frameworks. So the objective was to support these countries in realizing the economic benefits from sustainable trade, sustainable use of oceans, mainly through three main areas. First, through improving the capacity of beneficiary governments and relevant stakeholders to identify competitive products and services in key ocean-based sectors, and to also assess and identify the institutional legal framework that support the sustainable ocean governance and trade. Second, by promoting sustainable management and trade in ocean-based sectors at the national and regional level. And third, by strengthening capacity to define policy options and implement policy priority actions. Okay, so before I share with you some of the details of the implementation of the project, let me talk to some words about the general trends of the ocean economy to give you a sense of the importance of the sectors and to provide a context for the project. So the oceans economy has a value estimated value of $24 trillion when measured in terms of assets. It considers 406 billion in terms of global production. UNCTAD has estimated the value of global exports in ocean-based goods and services in $2.5 trillion. Here I would like to tell you that we have launched a new data set. I will use this time for self-promotion on our new product. It's a new data set of trade data in ocean economy sectors. It includes data at country and sectoral level for 13 oceans economy sectors. And the data is based on a novel categorization that we prepare here at UNCTAD. So you can visit our webpage to see that. In terms of maritime transport, data shows that 178 million tons of goods are moved through the oceans and valued in 401 billion in 2020. Also, 10% of the global population relies on fisheries for their livelihood. If we talk about social impact, it's important to note that the oceans economy provides income and employment for around 250 million people, most of them in coastal areas in developing countries. Also, 90% of all sea fishers and farmers are small-scale operators. If we consider the environmental impact of the oceans economy, we can see that the fisheries, only of the fisheries, for example, it's important to know that 1/3 of global stocks are exploited and unsustainable. Also, that the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing steals about 23 billion from our oceans every year and affects 1 in every 5 fish caught. Well, all this data comes from the FAO Sofia report, but the data on trade of ocean goods that is prepared by us. Sorry for that.
Okay, so the budget of the OETS project was $650,000 for the 4 years, and it was implemented in collaboration with the UN Division on Oceans Affairs and the Law of the Sea, DOAS. So we took care of the trade part, and they took part of the legal framework part. So each country selected their own focus. So for Barbados, the focus was the tuna sector and value addition. For Belize, the general focus was on multi-species fish management. And for Costa Rica, the focus of the project was on marine coastal fisheries and big pelagic. So how did we prepare the strategies? The figure on the screen shows the project flow chart. The project had 3 main phases: formulation, implementation, and dissemination. During the formulation phase, we conducted preliminary data analysis of ocean sectors in the country. We did some missions, 3 field missions in early 2018, 1 to each country, to set the stage of the project and to identify and to meet stakeholders, focal points, to prepare a map of key stakeholders, and to undertake the selection of the main preliminary sectors to provide focused analysis. The criteria for the selecting the sector was economic, legal, social, environmental, and also domestic political indicators. And we gave a special consideration to medium and small scale producers and cooperatives. The idea was not to leave anyone behind in the discussion, so all the main stakeholders should be there. Their main interests should be there. After that, we were able to prepare the reports, the OETS reports, and based on a framework that included 5 pillars: the economic, the environmental, the social, scientific, and governance. And we submitted the findings for peer review and validation and recommendations by national stakeholders. So we did workshops in each country in which we presented the findings, and they told us their views, and they also proposed actions to be included in the priority strategy of actions. After completing the strategies, then each country from this list of potential actions selected a couple to from their particular customized action plans to be implemented. And yeah, that was the final part of the project. Then the dissemination, after the implementation part, we did the dissemination, in which we had a regional workshop and multilateral, and we have presented the findings of the project in several multilateral events. In the case of Belize, the sectors selected were marine fisheries, finfish, and seafood processing sectors, queen conch and spiny lobsters. So that was the main topic of the OETS publication. So we produced two main outputs in terms of publication, the strategy and an assessment of the regulatory framework. You can access these documents on the, with the QR code, and then they're going to be, the links are there in the PowerPoint, okay? The objective of the Belize strategy was to assess the potential, the economic potential and regulatory needs of these sectors, and to present an action plan that will present that will enable sustainable trade in the sectors studies. So the plan for Belize included several activities, including improving the resilience of the fisheries and seafood processing sector, to create synergies with ongoing activities and projects that the country was conducting at that time. So that was the main objective, not to replicate and just to build capacity. The government selected as priority actions to be implemented to support the development and a validation of a climate resilient multi-species finfish management plan. So for that, we engaged experts, and we had a workshop in which this finfish management plan was validated. So the main stakeholders worked together, defining the main species and working in this effort. And the plan was validated in January 2022, so earlier this year, by the Belize Fisheries Department, and was published. This was a priority for the local stakeholders and also for the government, because it contributed to reduce pressure to the resources that were overexploited, the resources that could be exploited, and contributed to the sustainable use of the fishery resources, and to increase potential and to promote diversification and trade of the resources. In the case of Barbados, you can see the main three publications, and it's the strategy for this country, and also we did an economic and trade aspects of fisheries and coastal and marine environmental services, and the legal and the analysis of the legal institutional framework. So we have three publications in this country, in this case, that you can access. For Barbados, the strategy, the OETS strategy, included a proposal to increase the value of the tuna exports of the island. If fully implemented, they could increase the revenues from tuna exports significantly, from around 300,000 to 2015 to 7 million 2027, and that will increase a lot the potential gains of fishers. And that was in this strategy we work in collaboration with FAO. This was a particular case. In addition to this proposal, the Barbados OETS also included a series of smaller priority actions that could boost the ocean's economy of this country. The selected priority actions, the actions that the government selected in this case, conduct research to explore the market potential for both local and export of swordfish, and to conduct an experimental fishing exercise to identify best fishing techniques and costs for swordfish harvesting. And finally, to do a training exercise to demonstrate best practices for the use of dehooking devices for the release of the endangered, threatened and protected species, such as sea turtles. and sensitive species such as the blue and white marlin. So we just finalized these activities until last week. So we're assessing the experience and checking how the trainings went. In the case of Costa Rica, the main publications produced are also available online. Es de Costa Rica Estrategia de Economía de los Océanos y Comercio, que estaba enfocada en atún dorado, pez y peces costeros. And this overview of the trade and economic and trade aspects of fisheries and seafood in seafood sectors in Costa Rica, and also as in the other two countries, the ocean governance in Costa Rica, and an overview of the legal and institutional framework. So you can download this. For Costa Rica, the priority action consisted on support for the design and registration of a collective trademark for sustainable and responsible fish and seafood products, and also accompanying this trademark training on the use and bylaws and governance and affiliation, training to the relevant stakeholders. Well, the registration and related government regulations supporting this trademark were the result not only of work of Antara Dualos, but also is a common effort, a joint effort done by the Ministry of Foreign Trade, COMEX, the National Institute of Fisheries, INCOPESCA, and the National Chamber of Exporters of Fisheries and Aquaculture of Costa Rica, la CANEP. And we all work together because this trademark could not be done only by the government. You know, it has to be a private institution that will be the owner of this tool, because the trademark secures legal, sustainable, and traceable trade of marine fisheries and aquaculture products from this country. By everyone that is part of this trademark can say that is fulfilling this requirement, and so not comply with all the requirements. And we launched the trademark in November last year, and the final registration of the mark took place in May this year. And important to highlight here that this is the first trademark of this type in Costa Rica and in Central America, in the Caribbean too. Well, the collective trademark offers like a common umbrella. So all the people that are under they're affiliated, they can say, we comply with these requirements, and that can help national domestic consumers to make informed decisions. National and international consumers too. It is expected from information from the government that the collective trademark will benefit more than 9,500 Costa Rican that work in fisheries and aquaculture sector, and that represents 0.45% of the country local workforce. So we hope that this trademark will contribute to reduce poverty, to improve food security, to expanding markets, to promote gender equality, and to improve the sustainability of production and consumption. Well, to conclude, I want to highlight the importance of develop close relationships with focal points and partnerships from the outset of the project. Because for us, that was key to the success of the activities and the project in general. You know, we identify focal points that we kept through the whole project when possible. We identify the main stakeholders. We try to foster the beneficiary ownership of the project, because it was for them, and they collaborated a lot with us. They kept, we made efforts to keep them engaged through the whole life of the project, and we also made significant efforts to include all actors in relevant value chain. As these issues we identify as key for the success of the project. So for us, we were able to achieve all the many milestones of this long-term project. we were able to do it thanks to the collaboration and engagement of the focal points and their ownership of the processes of outcomes. The national focal point facilitated selection of sectors, they identified consultants, and identified main important relevant stakeholders, and help us in the validation process. Also, we work a lot with other UN agencies like UNDP, FAO, private sector organizations, cooperatives, and civil society organizations to build trust and to buy in the project and to support the outcomes. Yeah, so that was the main thing that we did to make this work. Also, the priority action, the final activities implemented in the country were always decided by beneficiaries, of course, based on the resources. So that also helped us to keep the interest from their side, and they help us. We were all working together towards the same goal. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of showing this project, and I will ask colleagues to please play the video that is at the end of this presentation, where you can see from the words of the same beneficiaries what do we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, in absentia, Claudia, as well as David, who are doing, as you can see, a lot of work in this field of international blue trade and the blue economy, actually working closely with the relevant governments in Belize. We heard Barbados, Costa Rica in this region, and really did helping them to develop out, their blue economy tradable sectors. So we heard about, for instance, fisheries, and in particular, I think it was in Barbados, tuna, how to develop each of these sectors within the blue economy. So as Claudia mentioned, we have a video to share. I guess that's based on the beneficiaries' perceptions of the projects. And I will share now.
The OITS project is a UN implemented project that really seeks to assist and support developing countries to better understand and analyze what ocean-based economic sectors we have out there and how we can enhance and strengthen those sectors while ensuring that sustainability factor is also considered. The OITS project has 3 phases, the first being assessment and formulation, the second being validation, and the third being dissemination.
Of sustainable development known as economic development, social development, and environmental. In addition to that, governance as well as the need for scientific research were identified as critical. In terms of governance, we've already signed on with all of the major conventions that relate to the management and conservation of fisheries resources. For example, the United Nations Convention of the Sea.
Knowledge exchange was a key part of the OITS project. We cannot speak about managing a natural resource without local knowledge. It is one of the underlying pillars that has been able to build the capacity at the local level.
Uno de los factores más importantes para lograr un desarrollo sostenible es el que se trabaje al lado de los pescadores. Goal really is for us to add value to our stable, commercially important products. We also have multi-species finfish management plan.
La marca colectiva que se ha diseñado en conjunto para efectos de demostrar transparencia, inocuidad, trazabilidad, el desempeño social y ambiental que esto podría generar a todas las comunidades costeras y acuicultores.
The full implementation of the OETS project can lead to Barbados, particularly as a small island developing state, accessing large international markets that it doesn't currently access.
We have challenges. We don't have the kind of resources. We don't have the infrastructure. We also have limitations in terms of capacity. Traditionally, we're people who have been using the resources, and we want to be able to continue to do that.
So I hope that was very enjoyable and educational. I'm very, very pleased to now welcome our next speaker, who is going to speak in place of the original speaker on your program, Ms. Alice Tipping, who is the head of, I think, economy issues at the IISD, the International Institute of Sustainable Development. But we do have someone here who is equally competent to speak to you. Her name is Miss Aiva Baksoa-Skaiti. I'm pretty sure I butchered your name, although we tried to practice it. But Yeva is a senior policy advisor at the IISD, and she works on sustainable trade issues. During her 15-year diplomatic career at the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Yeva has worked on a broad range of issues related to the international economy, trade, sustainability, the environment, and energy. And there she represented the government of Lithuania as the deputy permanent representative at the WTO, and also served as the chairperson of the WTO Committee on Subsidies and Countervailing Duties. She also served as representative at the UN, EU, and vice chairperson of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Joint Working Party on Trade and the Environment, and has participated in international negotiations and provided advice to both domestic and international policymakers on issues related to foreign policy, trade, and sustainability. I hope I'm coming across okay and there's not too much of a delay in my internet connection, but I think you would have heard that Ava is very well qualified to speak to us about some of the ways that her organization is working on blue economy issues and just generally the environment for blue economy issues in international trade and trade negotiations. So without further ado, Ava, I understand you have a PowerPoint. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jen, and it's really a pleasure to be joining this course with the lineup of this amazing speakers. I know that an excellent set of speakers will be coming right after me, but let me first present the apologies from Alice, who was not able to join this course today, as she had a different engagement and is speaking at the same time as this course is taking place. Nevertheless, yes, let me just quickly pronounce my name, which is Yeva Baksoa-Skaiti. Jen got it absolutely right. I work at the IISD, and I lead the work on trade and environment, and that includes a lot of work on the fisheries subsidies. Now, I understand that this course has already followed quite a few speakers taking you through the issue of fisheries management, and I'm also using the opportunity from the fact that Ambassador Santiago Wills and Sai from WTO Secretariat Rules Division will be speaking more about the historic fisheries subsidies agreement that was just concluded at the WTO this summer. And I will try to connect those two parts, presenting you parts of the work that IASD does on fisheries subsidies and different fisheries related matters. Now, as you will know, IASD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, is a reasonably big think tank that has different programs operating in the areas of sustainable development, and that includes economic law as well as energy. In terms of what we do, we often provide an impartial, though not always normatively neutral advice, as our basic goal of operation is the aim for the policy changes that lead us to sustainable development. And as we are providing this type of advice, support, or even research, we sometimes do the policy case studies. And here I thought that today what we could talk about is several case studies that we have done looking at the issue of fisheries subsidies and fisheries management in terms of particular fisheries, meaning specific regions, specific species of fishes, and looking how the evidence from there can be used in what was then the negotiations for a fisheries subsidies agreement. As Ambassador Wills will tell you, those negotiations will continue after the little break, and that evidence will still serve the countries who can look at this evidence and take the conclusions and use them there. Now, if you allow me to share my screen, yeah, let's take it from there. And you will see that we will be going through, three or possibly two case studies, really depending on how the time allows. I know that Jen has been extremely generous with her time allocation for the ISD today. As the colleagues from ISD have also left us a little bit of space, we might be able to go through all three cases, but we will kick off with the studies by species, because we thought that those are the most interesting cases. We have made two studies. One of them is the study of shrimp fisheries in Latin American countries, and the second one of albacore tuna in Western and Central Pacific. There's also the third case study that we might have time to cover, that is the central and provincial government support for marine fishing in Indonesia. And here we didn't look at the fisheries by species, but rather by type of support measures centrally and provincially. So here, let me start with the first case study that we have done looking at the case of shrimp in Latin America. Our key findings, as I present them immediately to you, was that, first of all, shrimp fishing, especially in that region, generates significant landed value and employment, both for industrial and artisanal sectors. However, most shrimp populations are really likely overexploited, and several fleets are really overcapitalized. And that is at least partially due to capacity enhancing subsidies. There are some negative impacts on bycatch species and some instances of irregular fishing in pretty much all sectors. A general lack of information on fisheries catches and subsidy effect don't really allow us to really analyze each scenario as thoroughly as we would have preferred, or to make policy suggestions as precisely as we would have loved to. However, given available information on current overcapacity and overfishing, the subsidy disciplines that have just been agreed and that might be agreed in the future may well increase short and long-term benefits by improving fisheries performance and incentivizing compliance with national management plans, which I'm pretty sure you had a chance to discuss previously. So let's look at the study areas and the shrimp production in the study. You will see that most of the shrimp produced in the countries under the study were actually a product of aquaculture. And those type of shrimp farms would not be the subject of new fishery subsidy rules. However, the remaining 20% would be. And out of those 20%, 12% would be fished by industrial fisheries and 8% by artisanal fisheries, meaning artisanal trawls or even semi-industrial trawls. You will see that the slight red line demarks the area of the fisheries that was covered by the study. It is the coastal areas of Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Panama. And the shrimp fishing in that area generates around $280 million a year. That is quite a steady income. It also supports around 45,000 direct and indirect jobs. And the artisanal sector of the shrimp fishing does not cover only the shrimp, but also around 145,000 jobs in the sectors that support the fishing sector, like the processing, packaging, preparation, and alike. I think even the transport is covered in that. A large amount of employment happens out of the water, both before and after fishing, and it also happens in the informal economy. It's a sector that is really thought about when actually crafting trade rules, but it's nevertheless important. Here we have showed the trends of landings of shrimp in each of the countries covered by the study. And you will see that the steady trend for each country is going downwards, meaning that shrimp fishing is becoming less and less profitable because less and less shrimp is being caught by the fishers. It is quite a strong evidence of overfishing. And this is, while the data is coming from FAO, Fisheries and Agriculture Organization, from 2018, even the updated data, most up-to-date data, I think, of 2021 will indicate almost exactly the same trends. There are, of course, additional fish catches or shrimp catches that is not really covered by national statistics because, of course, that is coming from the unofficial economy. However, we do not think that it would change the FAO's data significantly. There are also diverse types of shrimp that are being fished and that are being covered by this data. And we will not try to read through all of them. I think what is more important is the color coding of each type of shrimps that shows either in blue the types of shrimps that in each country are maximally exploited, meaning that just stepping over that line would already mean that the stock is overexploited. The pretty much dominant yellow color shows the types of shrimp that are overexploited. And there are several types of shrimps, the stocks of which the status of stocks were not really assessed. And you will see that it's reasonably sad picture, because of all the cases or of all the countries in this case study, most are fishing the shrimp, the status of which is either maximally or overexploited. We have also looked at what exactly the shrimp trawls are catching in the area, and we also realized that while they are mostly targeting shrimp, approximately 80% of their catch is not shrimp at all. It's a bycatch of other species, and 70% of that bycatch is completely discarded because that catch might not be commercially valuable, and that also most likely means that the status of those stocks will not be assessed. You might have heard previously that the species which mostly benefit from stock assessments are commercially valued species, such as shrimp or albacore tuna that we will be talking about in the next case study. So just think about this sadness for a little bit, that all this effort is being made for pretty much 30% of a catch, and 70% of that is just being discarded and never assessed. So we don't really know what happens there. Now, we will look at the current state of governance and management that exists in the countries for the shrimp fishing. And in most nations, it involves some limited access for vertically integrated industrial firms, and it's less regulated artisanal sector. Each country in the area under the study used input controls. For example, fishing licenses, restrictions to the number, type of vessels and gear, seasonal area closures, efforts to reduce a bycatch, such as bycatch reduction devices. IUU fishing always includes some type of violation of the regulations above. So, for example, it could be fishing without license, it could be fishing during the time of closure, it could mean that the fishers are deactivating the bycatch reduction devices, or they catch the protected species. Notably, unreported catches in shrimp fisheries occur virtually all the time, and they are considered as illegal.
I'm
Yes?
sorry, just sorry to interrupt, but there was a question from a participant about what do you mean when the term discarded is used in relation to the non-shrimp catch?
Well, discarded means exactly what it means. It means that this fish is not, those catches are never making it to the shore and are never used further. It just means that once caught, the fish is just being dumped back into the water. It is, and well, the survival rate, I guess, varies depending on the species and of how that was released. So we didn't look deeper into that because our study did not focus on that. But as that catch is considered not really commercially valuable, most fishers would just treat it as well as trash. And well, I think it really depends on how strong the regulation on that is, but even for more valuable species, the control is not always there. Sorry for not having seen your question in advance, but please keep them popping like that, because well, I'll be speaking for a relatively long time. So it's really better that we just stop immediately once you have a question. And thanks for it. So yeah, illegal. So you just have this little table showing the input controls that the governments use, and that shows just how much management capacity one needs to have, meaning it's relatively easy to issue a license. It's much more difficult to control the fishing time, especially, well, I wouldn't say on the ground, but in sea. And when doing this case study, we realized that also we have very, very little information about existing subsidy programs. And even when such information was present, it didn't really indicate any type of subsidy goals or outcomes. Sometimes it's being outlined in the most basic terms, but really the subsidies are just being provided without, especially not numerical goals, like, even if it's a socially oriented subsidy. So we did, yes, here it goes, it moves again. You will see this reasonably tricky graph, but once we get through it, you will see it being repeated later on, and it will be easier to grasp it. Basically, the red bar on the right shows you all fishing, all the costs of shrimp fishing vessel that occur. They are being split by the type of data and type of categories that we got. So and it will always go up to 100%. For example, if you look at case of Mexico, it's the bar on the top right corner. You will see that approximately almost 40% of the cost of shrimp fishing vessel in Mexico consists of fuel. Then you add an extra 20% for labor, another 10 or so of supplies, and I would say 80-ish for maintenance, a bit of other, and that's your 100% of a cost. On the left side, the green blue bar shows the income and how it corresponds to the size of a cost. In this very same case of Mexico, the green bar indicates just how much the landings are matching the costs. And you will see that the landings consist pretty much of 80% of the costs. And that tells you quite clearly that the landings alone would not be covering the costs that a shrimp fishing vessel had just enabled to be keeping up with this activity. And in order to make this activity profitable, the government or some kind of provincial body of Mexico has contributed to the profitability of the specific vessel, or not specific vessel, but this is an average information. But it had contributed by paying subsidies to fuel, which pretty much bumped up the income to 100%, and another 10 added % were subsidies for maintenance. And you will see that, for example, in case of Mexico, those additional 30% were actually what made the fishing activity profitable. You can see in all those 4 cases that the help of data that we collected with Marviva and Finpesca, how much exactly our study showed that the subsidies for fuel, for gear, for maintenance contributed to the profitability of shrimp fishing activity in each individual country. And the story is reasonably sad, because that's a story of overfishing, meaning that the fishing as an activity by itself, just through its landing, is not profitable anymore. The governments pretty much feel like they're obliged to pay subsidies, and in return, they're contributing further and further away to that unprofitability of a sector. The 2 sectors, and you will see that, for example, Mexico's artisanal fisheries on your lower left actually proved to be reasonably profitable as a sector, and the subsidies there contributed much less to an already reasonably profitable activity. In a bit similar way, Costa Rica, where our data showed less degree of overfishing, also had a reasonably good profitability from landings only. However, Nicaragua, where the overcapacity was quite high, also showed a pretty much absolute need for a certain amount of subsidies from a social point of view. So this is what we see. What are the effects of subsidy disciplines? We already see that most shrimp stocks in the region were overexploited or maximally exploited. We also saw that bycatch stocks were unassessed. Illegal, unreported fishing was prevalent, not so much unregulated because it was quite regulated, and was very little transparency in monitoring, enforcement, policy analysis. Capacity enhancing subsidies, despite uncertainty regarding their effects, were really in use in most countries in the study area, especially through fuel subsidies, but also a bit of maintenance and gear subsidies, as we have just seen. I'm trying to figure out what my slides are showing. And here we are actually looking at the subsidy disciplines as they were agreed in the fisheries subsidies agreement. And we will provide a little bit of examples of how we see them affecting the situation on the ground. Of course, that's just an estimate, and especially based on a study that has been performed a bit ago. So we see that currently, subsidies to IUU fishing can be affected by, first of all, a subsidizing W2 member identifying IUU activity by vessels of operators. It subsidizes itself. A vessel can also be listed by RFMO within the jurisdiction of a specific fishery. And also another coastal state might identify IUU activity by foreign vessels within its EEZ. We looked at one example here, the example where a subsidizing W2 member identifies IUU activity by its own vessels or operators. as most of the shrimp fisheries in the study area are regulated, we don't think that there could be many findings of unregulated fishing. We think that illegal fishing, the fishing without license and misreporting would be problems under existing rules. So those things might occur. And the impact of subsidy rule will really depend on how IUU fishing defined, identified, and prosecuted in each country. And we stressed on the prosecuted, well, enforcing is probably the term that more people would use, because it really depends how many officers and how well they are trained on the ground to actually detect that type of fishing. Where fines for illegal or unreported fishing are low, this subsidy prohibition could be really, really effective deterrent. Where such penalties are actually strict, for example, in the cases where license can be withdrawn, like in Ecuador, the impact of subsidy prohibition is marginal because the fine or the penalty is already quite high. Now, we will also look at the prohibition that is applied to the subsidies for fishing or fishing-related activities regarding an overfished stock that is already part of new rules. We think that a prohibition would affect most fleets for which there is subsidy information. As we have seen before, shrimp and the bycatch might include at least some overfished stocks. This may impact on profitability of industrial fleets. There's also a new rule in the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement that Ambassador Wills will talk about, that special care and exercise due restraint must be exercised when granting subsidies to fishing or fishing-related activities regarding stocks where status is unknown. And here we're talking about that bycatch, but also those shrimp types for which the status is unknown. There is no strong discipline on that, but it will be an issue quite relevant when it comes down to the implementation in this region. Now, when talking about possible disciplines regarding overcapacity and overfishing, basically what we only have is the prohibition of subsidies in the high seas. We have listed a long list of options, and this will be the case in the study, that can be used in the future negotiations, as those options were not really yet covered in the first part of Fisheries Subsidies Agreement negotiations, and the negotiations will be picked up. We still think that many of those options can still be considered in the future. And for example, one of this option is further analyzed here. We're speaking about the idea that any subsidies that is lowering the vessels' operating costs, that includes the fuel, should be prohibited. That's one of the ideas that has been discussed on the in the negotiating rooms of the WTO, and we looked through this case study on what specific impact it would have for the fisheries and for shrimp fishing in the region. And we thought that this option may have most impact on industrial shrimp fishing in Mexico and vertically integrated shrimp operations in Nicaragua. Remember those two bar charts where the landings cost and the landings value were so much lower than the cost of operating the vessel? Those are exactly the cases where this option would be most impactful. The effort would likely decrease for these fleets if such subsidies would be prohibited, because certain vessels would not continue operating. There is an interesting question on the impact on artisanal shrimp fishing in Mexico, the one where we actually saw that the linemen were quite profitable. The fishing there appears to be profitable without subsidies on average, but it could also be quite dependent on fuel and VAT subsidies in years where the catch is less valuable. So this, this is complicated, and I'm sorry not to have a straightforward answer, but this might benefit a further study. We were also thinking about possible structure of special and differential treatment, meaning the exemptions for developing countries and how they could best be structured, especially as some ideas were already on the ground. And we thought that if the exemption for easy fishing would cover all subsidies there, then all those subsidies identified would actually be continuing, because most of the shrimp fishing in the area is happening in the EEZ. If only the exemption for subsidies for artisanal fishing would be applied, it would cover quite small fraction of subsidies currently provided, because most subsidies go to industrial farms. It can actually reduce industrial effort if subsidies were removed, but we don't really know how that would go. We also thought about an idea that was flown around in Geneva about prohibiting all subsidies for operating costs, however, excluding subsidies for fuel. And we realized that in this case, since fuel is by far most common subsidy in those fisheries, then the disciplines would pretty much be irrelevant. Now I'm gonna show you what we call the pathway for subsidy reform, thinking about the subsidies from a very broad sense, and we try to categorize them by the harmfulness level, and we'll start from up there, because we still think that there are types of subsidies that are beneficial and that absolutely are needed to, especially when it goes down to the fisheries that are less industrial. So we are absolutely, I think it's in 2019 we thought that subsidies in shape of access rights, like fishing areas and quotas, were absolutely a good thing. The bycatch avoidance support, like a troll gear, was also the type of support that government could be providing to the vessels and operators. The bycatch avoidance through gear switching was even a better option, as well as investment in alternative livelihoods, meaning that the subsidies were supporting the phasing out from fishing activities by fishers who didn't see their activities as too profitable, especially in the absence of further subsidies like the ones for fuel. Now, there was a type of subsidies that we thought were a bit ambiguous. There was a gear replacement to improve cost efficiency. There were buybacks, and there was added value programs absent output controls. And then, you know, if the most harmful type of subsidies, and OECD was pretty straightforward about it, were the subsidies for fuel and gear and vessel replacements. And however, those are the subsidies that in some cases are really adding that little plus that is making the activity profitable and keeping fishers in the water. Now, I'm briefing in and briefing out before moving into the second case study. And this will take you to a different ocean. This will take us to the case of the southern longline tuna fishery in the Western and Central Pacific.
Hi, Eva.
Yes.
Before we went there, because it's been already maybe a half hour, I was just wondering if there were any questions from the audience. I mean, we have another, maybe I would say 15 minutes about a presentation. Yeah, I mean, I know you had suggested 3, but I don't know if there would be time for all 3. So I've just given you the option of choosing among those which one you would really think would be most useful to this audience. But I wanted to know if there were any questions or comments from the audience before we went to the next presentation.
Thanks a lot, Jan. So look, no worries for me. I already thought that I'll stick to 2 and I'll keep the third one just in case I really dash through. If anyone would have questions in the audience, and if we would have even more questions, we can just spend the remaining time a bit more interactively. And if in case that's not the case, then let's just proceed to the second study, and I'll make it in 15.
Okay, well, we'll see if maybe there are no questions from the audience. I mean, I thought, you're going into all of the scenarios regarding the subsidies in the context, and I hope you can hear me well. Or the context of the Mexican subsidy and shrimp situation was really specific in terms of, outlining all of the various scenarios you all have considered on the effect of these subsidy disciplines. And just to give the audience members a little bit of a teaser, all of it will be revealed. All of the meanings of some of the terms that IEVA has been using will be revealed, if you don't already know, by the presentation that we're going to hear next from those closely involved in this fisheries subsidies agreement at the WTO. I think this is a really great way of seeing in practice, right, what the impact of these subsidies are, especially as it relates to the Mexican shrimp fishing sector. And really some really great statistics that you all have managed to compile on these impacts as it relates to Mexico. So I don't know if there were any questions, any terms that folks didn't really, maybe didn't grasp as well, that you may want Eva to go back over or to explain in more detail. Okay, so if that's not the case, we're happy to go to the next case study of I think you said the Western and Southern Pacific, and looking at tuna there. Excellent. And that probably is more like the Caribbean situation. I don't know if it would be the same with tuna, but certainly in terms of the impact on it's Western and Central Pacific, on the smaller countries like the Pacific. I think that would also give us some other insights that would be useful. So thank you so much, Eva, and please proceed.
Thanks a lot, Jen. And yes, I tried to drag out the multi-country studies because I thought that it could be probably more interesting and more relevant to our participants rather than just diving full head on into one country analysis. As especially the commercial fishing of certain species is really pretty much the lifeline of quite a few smaller island economies. And here we go, one of them, right? Southern longline tuna fishery in Western and Central Pacific. So to anyone who has a question while I'm speaking, please shoot it right away. As previously, I'm just showing you quickly the area that was covered by this specific study. So you will see that there is quite a bit of a coverage here. You will know that Southern albacore tuna is actually one of the most commercialized species. In 2017, the value of its sales were $304 million. And we have selected that specific fisheries, but it covers several countries. And in this case, 6 countries accounted for 85% of vessels targeting South albacore tuna in 2017. You will see that among those countries was China, Chinese Taipei, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and French Polynesia. This is not to say that we covered all fishing done, for example, by China, because that would demand a huge study of its own, but we're only speaking about the area that was already shown here in this map before. So let's talk about the type of fishery that was explored by this study. It's actually a fishery of pretty much almost 300 vessels that really have a big range in terms of size and onboard storage as well as freezing facilities, meaning that some of those vessels could be really artisanal, but there's also a decent degree of industrial fishing in the fishery. Many of them, they're really following the fish. I think my slide says they're opportunistic. I'm not sure it's a vessel character, but apparently they are. And those trips can really be very diverse, and they depend on a type of a vessel. While you cannot imagine an artisanal fishery vessels staying in the water for 2 years. Some of them actually really do, and we're of course talking about much bigger, much more industrial fleet. Now, fleet ownership over there also varies. A lot of vessels operate out of China or Chinese Taipei, but there are national vessels that only fish in EEZ, for example, in French Polynesia. There are Pacific Island country flag vessels who are owned and operated by Chinese or Chinese Taipei companies, for example, in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, under their bilateral agreements that they have. There are also Pacific Island country flag vessels that are owned or have joint ventures with China or Chinese Taipei, for example, in Fiji. So there is a diversity in terms of ownership and the operation methods. Now, target stocks are really healthy, and really illegal fishing is not really present in this particular fishery, but misreporting the catch is happening quite often. So you will see the risk identified to this particular fishery on the right side of your screen, and you will see that most violations are the ones related to the reporting, but also to some post-harvest risks, for example, mislabeling the tuna. There's a bit of unlicensed fishing, but it's not really meaningful. And we can see that overfishing is basically not really occurring for species that are targeted in this fishery. However, there is a bycatch, and that species is being overfished. That's an oceanic white-tip shark. So the bycatch is actually the species in danger. Yet, when we speak about the health of fisheries, we are not really covering the full picture. And economic overfishing is occurring there. And it's increasingly difficult for the catch to be really economic. So only the vessels which are getting subsidies are able to continue fishing, whereas those that are not getting the subsidies need to go out of business. And this is where the economic health of fisheries is really under danger. We have an RFMO, but also sub-regional and national level governance there. And as you will remember, we have done in the previous case with individual countries. Here we have looked at different types of vessels, and we tried to analyze on how the income structure reflects the cost structure. And once again, you see the cost reflected on the bar on the right, which is always at 100%. And you will see that the revenues are pretty much split with the costs. However, it's the profitability that comes from the subsidies in case of Chinese longliners, meaning the vessels that are larger than 24 meters, and those vessels are also quite often industrial fishers. You will also see what happens when the fuel prices suddenly drop and the vessels lose the fuel subsidy. That means that suddenly, without the fuel subsidies, the vessels are barely making the ends meet. And especially when we're talking about the Chinese Taipei longliner, where the fossil fuels barely were existing, they were only receiving operational cost subsidies. All operation was barely profitable. When we look at the revenues of, for example, Fijian offshore longliner, that activity was even less profitable, and it was only a tiniest fuel and bait subsidy that helped it to get through a year. The same case applies to the French Polynesian longliner that was profitable mostly due to tax rebates. So once again, the whole activity, while the fishermen were able to make ends meet and keep the lifestyle going, it was only possible due to certain reduction of their operational costs. Now, we see the types of subsidies that are provided in the different countries of this particular fishery. You will see that the vessel construction and vessel modernization were a rather frequently met type of subsidy that we saw in case of Chinese and possibly Chinese Taipei vessels, as well as in French Polynesia. Whereas in Fiji, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands, we saw subsidies for vessel modernization and transfer. Oh, I see a very, very, very long question. Let me have a look at that. In the same way as over extends jurisdiction, taxation, shouldn't the same principle be used to monitor long haul ships? Ensuring that perpetrators are sufficiently taxed to compensate the affected countries. Okay, basically, if I get the question right, there is a suggestion to actually look at the possibility to tax the perpetrators sufficiently to compensate affected countries, and especially to make sure that this compensates for social and environmental costs from those activities. I think it's a very, very, very important question, especially when we think about the profile of perpetrators. Well, what's in the question addressed as perpetrators. We often think about the industrial fishing fleets and the damage that they might do, and this is what we're talking about when we're talking about social and environmental costs. Now, really costing those damages is a challenging part, and I'm pretty sure that quite a few governments in the region would really think that this would be fair and this would establish a type of justice, but costing those things is a bit challenging to start with, especially when we're talking about social costs. You will see, for example, a World Bank study that's called the Sunken Billions, which is trying to estimate the costs of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, especially when we're talking about the scale. But it's not really easy to set the penalty there. And I think that Ambassador Wills will be talking a lot about the new fisheries subsidies agreement is trying to do. While it will not have a penalties system there is a way to seek justice under the WTO, and I really hope that his presentation will also go there and it will tell a little bit more about how this type of justice can be restored for countries, especially those who are suffering those social and environmental costs as that are rightly mentioned in the question. I hope I did answer that. And I'll try to get back here. So we did have a look at the subsidies. I will skip through all the suggestions and analysis that we have done over the specific ideas and how specific rules would affect this particular fishery. We have done it in the case of shrimp. I think that it allowed you to kind of build an idea in your heads of how a specific rule can be reflecting the specific situation, and how, for example, the Mexico that Jan has mentioned and I mentioned in my presentation can think about its specific situation when discussing a specific type of rule, or other countries too, right? And I jumped immediately to our suggestions that are stemming out of the study, which are closely linked to the suggestions that we had in the case of first study, that told us that first of all, we really need the set of rules that allows us to avoid economic overfishing. And there is a bit of that social impact that was just mentioned in the question above, right? We need to look at how to use the subsidy disciplines and fishery management measures together to make sure that we have just the right amount of, not just, but we have a sufficient amount of fish to make fishing a profitable activity for those that are fishing it, and to make sure that there is a social support network for those who would be exiting this business and entering new areas. We also must acknowledge that costs are really higher for Pacific Island countries because of their location. What we have seen, and I'm sorry not to have put those two cost bars together. Fuel costs are much higher for the vessels in Fiji, for the vessels in Vanuatu, for the vessels in French Polynesia, just because getting fuel to those islands costs more. We also need to think of economic impacts to Pacific Island countries' tuna industries. Thinking of how even phasing out the subsidies be done in the most impactful manner, allowing the necessary time for adjustment. We also need to think about increasing rent capture from fleets and allowing time for the domestic fleet to innovate, improve efficiency, and effectively compete in the global tuna market. So all this to say that I hope that I allowed you to dive into those two oceans and have a look at those two types of fisheries while covering this broader fisheries subsidies agreement, or at least making some kind of entry step into there and giving you a bit of questions possibly to ask to Ambassadors Wills and Sai, who would be following us.
Without further ado, and I didn't record these wonderful accolades, so I've just turned on the recording. I just wanted to say officially that we have with us former Ambassador Santiago Wills, who will soon be taking up a new position at the WTO Secretariat. He chaired the fisheries negotiations successfully to the completion after 20 years of it not having been completed and being one of the objectives under the SDGs. And he chaired it to completion from 2019 to the recently convened ministerial conference in 2022, July. And Say, who is now the acting head of the fishery subsidies the unit within at the WTO or at the World Trade Organization. So I understand that they are going to jointly present. I think we'll start with Santiago, who I imagine will talk about his experience chairing the negotiations, and then we will pass on the floor to Say, who will talk more, I guess, of the work that is left to be done. Although the gavel did come down on the agreement, there are still a number of technical elements that need to be completed for it to enter into force. So without further ado, over to you, Santi, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Genevieve. It's a pleasure being here, and very, very glad to be sharing this presentation with Say. We've been working together for the last 3 years, I think, almost, in the negotiations, and it's been great. So right until the last minute, when I'm leaving my post as ambassador and PR and chair here in Geneva, I'm so happy to be here with her, sharing this last presentation. So thanks, Genevieve. Yes, you're right. The idea would be that I'll tackle a little bit more of the process on how we got to the agreement from the fisheries subsidies negotiations to the agreement in June 2022, and Say we'll look a little bit more into the detail of the agreement and the specifics of what was agreed by ministers during the ministerial conference back in June 17, 2022. Let me see if we can share here our screen. First, okay, here, tick. Look at this. Not bad. Okay. Okay, wow. This is nice.
Looking good. I just wonder if you can make it into a slideshow. We had this issue yesterday, so I'm hoping you can, because we're seeing the main presentation small and, well, not so small, but alongside the other slides on the left. So if you go to slideshow and you open it up from the beginning, it will let the presentation be the main screen. Great.
If I do.
Well, now we can see the next slide.
Sorry.
No
We're
worries.
trying to see how to share the screen so that it actually works.
No problem. What you did a while ago was okay. I mean, you could see the notes, I think, but
There's something weird. Okay.
So apologies, there's a technical glitch at the WTO right now.
Okay.
Does that work? Do you see?
Maybe we can put again this one to see if it works. Or the.
So it's not so much that you need to make that bigger. It's more that you need to actually have it as the main, just the only slide you see. And currently we're seeing the slides, all the slides on the left. So if you go to slide show.
This one.
At the top.
At the top.
At the top.
Yeah, at the top you see slide
over here,
show.
but in the PowerPoint.
Right.
Okay,
There.
yeah.
Yep.
And go from beginning. Let's see if that works.
That's the same.
It's the same. Okay. So one of
Is
the
that-
options, no, not so much. One of the options is if you send the PowerPoint in the chat or to me or Andrea, we'll try and set it up from our side and see if it works.
Yeah.
Hold on, I'm just trying one more thing. So swap present to view and slideshow.
Usually yesterday some of the participants, there we go. Okay.
There we go.
Excellent,
Okay.
great.
Only issue now is say you need to make it a little smaller because as you made it bigger, the bottom is cut off.
Okay. Is that
Perfect.
okay?
Perfect now. That works. Oops. No. What you had before worked.
Yes, though I'll get back to it.
Okay.
No, below. It was in the PowerPoint. Yeah. Slideshow. Okay, I think it. And then I think we need to switch it again.
Does that work now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So once again, thanks, Jenny, for having us here. It's great sharing this experience with all of you. So first, I would like to take you through through a bit of the history of the negotiations from when we first got the mandate in the WTO to negotiate on fishery subsidies, how that mandate evolved up until we got the agreement, basically. And in the process, I'll share some of the insights of the negotiations and how things went, some of the challenges, some of the hurdles that we had to overcome to get around an agreement on fishery subsidies. So the first thing to say is that fishery subsidies is not entirely new for the organization. Fishery subsidies have been already included historically as part of the ASEM, that's the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures within the organization as part of the Uruguay round. It was just not addressed as sector specific for fisheries. It was just meant to be as part of the industrial subsidies covered by the ASEM. So all of those rules, trade-related rules, market distortion, etc., that apply in the ASEM apply to fisheries subsidies as well. So here it is, perfect. So all of those trade-related aspects of subsidies that we already have regulated in the WTO through the ASEM are applicable to the fisheries sector as well. However, the difference was that this time we wanted to look at the sustainability side of the subsidies on the fisheries sector. So for instance, in the ASEM, we have the prohibition of export subsidies, import substitution subsidies. We also have the subsidies with adverse trade effects and how those are the challengeable, the actionable subsidies within the ASEM. All that applies to fisheries sector. What does not apply from the ASEM, because there's no such element in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, are the effects on sustainability of natural resources. So initially in 2001, here it is. In 2001, and Jenny, if you were mentioning this before, we had the initial mandate on fishery subsidies. And the mandate seemed very simple at the beginning. And I've been speaking with some people that were here negotiating part of that Doha mandate at that time in 2000, 2001. And they all thought that the mandate to negotiate fisheries subsidies was actually quite simple, was going to be very easy. They were aiming at concluding this in 1, maybe 2 years at the most, because it seemed very simple. And the mandate basically said that we needed to clarify and improve the existing rules, that's the ASEM, the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, with link to the environment and, of course, developing members' LDC's concerns that relate to special and differential treatment. So it seemed fairly easy, clarify and improve the already existing rules. So what effect did that have at the beginning? That the ASEM is part of what we call the rules of the WTO, as with other trade remedies, so for instance, anti-dumping or safeguards. So given the mandate that we were going to clarify and improve those already existing rules, the division on rules in the WTO, and hence the negotiating group on rules, took over this mandate and started negotiating on fisheries subsidies based on the initial mandate in 2001. The mandate was maintained as it was in the Doha agenda until around 2005 in the 6th Ministerial Conference that was in Hong Kong, where the mandate was a bit elaborated. So now it said to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, plus special and differential treatment, of course. So as you can see, it stopped being clarified and improved the existing rules, and then it was elaborated into prohibiting certain forms of fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So very, very general, what was the rationale for changing that mandate? It was becoming clearer and clearer that the mandate that we had initially and what we were supposed to be doing was focusing on the effects of the environment, effects on sustainability. This is why we already at the Hong Kong Ministerial have the mentioning of two specific concepts on overcapacity and overfishing. So it became evident, it became clear that what we were meant to do was to look at the harmful subsidies, harmful fisheries subsidies. Harmful to what or why? Because they create overcapacity and they create overfishing. So that was the mandate in 2005 at the 6th Ministerial Conference. Then negotiations kept on moving, and around 2011, nothing really happened. So at the beginning, there was a lot of momentum, but at some point, as part of the spring package in 2011, the fisheries subsidy negotiations were included to try to find a result. It was not found. And after 2011, unfortunately, there was a lot of coming and going with the Doha agenda. So the negotiations were put to sleep, let's say, for a while. The momentum was lost in 2011. 2015, that you see it there in the presentation, was key. Because in 2015, all of our leaders, all the heads of government, heads of state, agreed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the UN SDGs. And within the SDG 14, there was a very specific mandate agreed. There was target 14.6 that you see it there on the screen. And target 14.6, I want to read the mandate we got from that specific target. It says, by 2020, prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing. IUU fishing is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries should be an integral part of the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiations. So with this 2015 renewed mandate through the SDGs, we got a very specific task. All our leaders, so even above our ministers, our WTO ministers said, WTO, you have to conclude these negotiations with these elements. And they set out the deadline by 2020 in the UN SDGs. Then we have another milestone in this race to get the agreement done. That was 2017, so already 16 years after the initial mandate. And that was 2 years after the UN SDGs at the ministerial conference in Buenos Aires, that was MC11, in December 2017, where ministers basically, an agreement was not done by 2017. So what ministers did was renew the mandate. So what they did was basically copy the mandate of the UN SDGs, repeated that mandate within the WTO structure. And what they said was, okay, guys, you need to conclude the negotiations by the next ministerial conference. That's MC12. At that time, when everyone was in Buenos Aires, MC12 was supposed to happen in 2019. So 2 years after the ministerial conference in Buenos Aires. But as you know, things got a bit crazy with COVID and everything was postponed. So that was the last mandate we got on the fisheries subsidy negotiations, the ministerial decision on MC11 in Buenos Aires that set the mandate or the deadline for the negotiations by MC12. Okay. Let me just put everything up here. Okay. So as I was mentioning, initially the MC12 was supposed to happen around December 2019, because the host of MC12 was going to be Kazakhstan. And because precisely of the weather in Kazakhstan, it was agreed that then the ministerial conference should move from December 2019, from winter in Kazakhstan to summer, because otherwise it would have been very, very difficult to hold it in Kazakhstan. So initially the ministerial conference moved to June 2020. And that's where we were. That was the deadline we had based on the UN SDGs and at the same time based on the MC11 mandate. So now let me take you to a big jump to 2019. So by MC11, there had been 2 attempts to have a consolidated text where members would base their negotiations on. First was in 2007, when ministers after the Hong Kong ministerial said, Chair, you need to prepare a consolidated text. It was prepared, but unfortunately in 2007, that text had no convergence enough or no consensus to be the basis of the negotiation. So it very quickly became a little bit complicated because a lot of members wanted to get their proposals in, and it just became a very difficult text. After MC11, something similar happened. But for MC11, the chair at that time had prepared a text to see if it was able to draw enough convergence, the consensus of the membership to become the agreement. Unfortunately, again, members were a little bit hard on the text and they wanted their language, they wanted their text in their text. So every proposal had to be included according to members. So very soon by MC11, that text became unreadable. It had 500 and something sets of brackets, meaning that there were 500 and something issues yet to be negotiated. There were around 13 to 15 alternatives for one single article. It was a bit too much. So we jumped to 2019. That was still the basis of how the negotiations we were working on. That's a document you see there on the screen. That is W274 Rev 6. In 2019, July 2019, that chair left. And in 2019, November, I was appointed as a new chair. And this is one of the anecdotes I usually tell students and whenever I talk about the fisheries negotiations. One of my first things I did when I became the chair was to meet with all the members in bilateral consultations. So I said, okay, members, what do we have to do now? How do we meet the mandate? Because we're clearly behind schedule. And almost everyone, virtually everyone said, Chair, we need to start negotiating on the basis of a text-based negotiations. And I said, this is great. What text should we use? The response was equally unanimous. There's no text, Chair. We cannot use any other text because we haven't been able to build a convergence text. So very clearly, it became evident to me that one of the first tasks that I would face would be to build a text for members to be able to work on that basis. So that's what started our full speed ahead in the negotiations with the help of SAE, with the help of the whole secretariat team, started working with members on how to consolidate their proposals, all the work that had been done until that point, picking up on different types of configurations, methods, facilitators, etc., to build the text. Long story short, in June 2020, we were able to present the first version of the text. But let's not forget that before June 2020, COVID struck. And here in Geneva, around March, beginning of March, the lockdown started. So no in-person meetings. It was very hard to transition from an in-person basis here in the W2 building into a virtual basis through whatever platform, Zoom or Interprefy or whatever platform was available. So it was a bit difficult. And part of the success story, let's say, of this agreement was that a lot of the work was done while we were still facing the pandemic. So the first version of the text was presented right after the lockdown started in March. So first version, June 2020. After that version, we had around, I think it was 7 versions. Oh yeah, it says 7 versions of the text until we had the last version sent to ministers a couple of months ago. And of course, it was a difficult process evolving that text based on every member's proposals, statements in the negotiating group, first virtually, then in person, bilateral consultations, a lot of methods. On 15th July 2021, this is another key milestone in the process. After the DG came to office and took office in March 2021, 1st of March 2021. And she put all her effort, all her enthusiasm into this negotiation. She knew this was going to be one of the deliverables that we had to present by MC12. So all her weight was put into the negotiations. We said, we need political guidance from above. And from above, we mean ministerial level. We were still in the middle of the pandemic. In some countries, a lot of lockdowns yet, flight restrictions. So we said, you know what, let's meet virtually. So we set up a virtual ministerial meeting, the 15th of July, 2021, with two specific questions from which we wanted to draw the political guidance from those ministers. And basically what we were seeking was their green light in saying, this text is the basis for negotiations. Fortunately, we got that after the meeting. So 108 or 109 ministers, I think, spoke that time virtually. It was a full day. And the bulk of the message was, yes, continue working on the base of the text, maybe correct here, correct there, correct this imbalance here or there, but this is the basis of the text, of the negotiations. So soon after the summer break, so this was right before the summer break, after the summer break, we started with, let me see if I'm skipping something that it's, okay, no. Yeah, so after the summer break, we established a 2-step approach. First step of a few weeks to start correcting those imbalances that ministers pointed out in the text. The second part, the second stage was clause by clause, article by article, almost word by word negotiation of the text. And why were we already there in 2021? Because of COVID, the June ministerial in 2020 had to be postponed. It was postponed initially, it was postponed, I think, even to 2021 straight, I think, to November 2021, 30th November 2021. So by that virtual ministerial meeting, we were aiming at MC12 concluding this agreement by November 2021. So we set up that that 2-stage process. It was, I must say, very hectic times. There were 2 straight weeks where I think we were going up until midnight, maybe even later during the night, looking at every single word, having breakout sessions with specific groups of members, drafting provisions to bring back to the whole plenary, the whole membership to look at, to approve, and keep on going. So at that point, right before the ministerial was supposed to happen, that second to last document you see in the second bullet was sent, W5. So that was the document that was sent to ministers when the ministerial was supposed to happen in 2021. 5 days before the ministerial was supposed to start, it had to be postponed again because of COVID. Omicron was the new variant at that time. Flights were being canceled. We had to move on. So the ministerial was postponed indefinitely. Later, 2022, it was agreed that was going to be June 2022. The text kept moving, kept evolving after that W5 text. We had to come back, sort of take out from the minister's desk the document, bring it back to a room, keep on negotiating some of the disciplines, and try to resolve some of the issues that were left for ministers to resolve at that time. We did all that work until June 2022, where again, we sent to ministers for MC12 the W20 text. Long story short, in the ministerial, because I know I'm already taking a lot of time, we had a 5-day ministerial when it was supposed to be a 3-day ministerial, very, very intensive. And at 3 a.m., 17 June 2022, ministers agreed to what we now can call the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. It was a huge moment because, as you can imagine, after 21 years of negotiations, we finally agreed by consensus in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of a very important international conflict that still takes place in Russia and Ukraine. We're able by consensus to conclude these negotiations. Of course, as Genevieve was saying, and I think Say will also mention this afterwards, there is a new mandate. Now we have to keep negotiating on some outstanding issues as a second wave of negotiations. So why is this a historic achievement? Well, first and foremost, we managed to conclude a 21-year process, and that in itself is pretty big, but it's very important because it delivers on the SDG target 14.6, and of course, the mandate from our ministers in the MC11 decision. But it also uses sustainability or places sustainability as the core of the agreement. So for the first time in the WTO, in the multilateral trading system, we have an agreement which core is sustainability. So that was part of the challenge. We had to move negotiators to change their mindset from trade, or trade distortions, market distortions, effects on price, etc., into sustainability-oriented negotiation. So this is also why it's a very important achievement for the organization. Again, SDG target fully met. It's met through a multilateral agreement. I think also for the first time, you will see a trade agreement or sustainability agreement that is more ambitious at a multilateral level than what is found at a regional or bilateral level. As I was saying, the first WTO agreement to focus on the environment, and it's the second agreement reached in the WTO, multilateral agreement reached in the WTO since the existence of the WTO. I think I might leave the second wave to say later in time to save a little bit of time. So what are the implementation challenges? And I usually talk about the challenges more from the perspective of opportunities for small states. So the agreement, and Say will explain this better in a couple of minutes, the agreement aims at prohibiting the harmful fishing subsidies. Harmful fisheries subsidies. And so not every subsidy, not artisanal fisheries subsidies, the harmful fisheries subsidies. And we have to notify the subsidies provided or granted to the fishing sector. So some of the challenges for small states, and these are challenges that will be a challenge for most states, I think, is first, complying with the notification and transparency obligations. There are very specific items of information that need to be notified to the WTO, like what subsidy is being granted, to whom, what type of subsidy that is, what's the status of the fish stock that is being fished, etc. Why is this important for the agreement? Because precisely one of the issues and why it took so long to negotiate the agreement was the lack of information. Some of the information that has to be, that will be provided through the agreement, members already are supposed to be providing it through the ASEM, through the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, but they're not doing it. So this is yet another mandate to do that. Second, integrating the fishery sustainability elements into their own fisheries management sector. So now when you're granting a subsidy, those agencies in each of our countries will need to think, will this subsidy affect sustainability in a way or will it not? And that changes a bit the mindset of how things will develop in the fisheries sector. Third, of course, strengthening the sustainable fisheries management systems. So in order to trigger certain disciplines, there has to be certain type of assessments of the fishing stocks or the fishery stocks. So it is important that science is the basis of this. So whether this means the way in which the artisanal fishers have been doing it for a while, or whether this means the most sophisticated science, the point is that we have the enough reference points to develop the status of the stock and be able to trigger the disciplines on fisheries subsidies. This is just one of the slides that we want to share with you on how important the blue economy, the ocean economy opportunities are. So the ocean economy is estimated to have an annual value of $2.5 trillion US. This is huge. It would be the 7th largest economy in the world. The oceans contribute to food security, employment, trade, and prosperity, and more than 3 billion people, either directly or indirectly, rely on the oceans for their livelihoods. So the appropriate use of the marine resources is key. If we keep on depleting the stocks as we're doing it, it's going to be an awful use of our resources. It will destroy the opportunities of the ocean economy. And just to give you a bit of the numbers, it's estimated that around $35 billion annually are granted to the fishing sector as subsidies. From those, it's estimated that around $22 billion a year are harmful subsidies, harmful in the sense that they either end up in those fishing illegally or those subsidies enable overcapacity or overfishing activities. So those are considered harmful subsidies, 22 billion out of 35 billion. So what this agreement intends is to drop all those subsidies, to prohibit those harmful subsidies and eliminate those subsidies granted that end up in the wrong hands of fishers doing illegal activities. And this is not just about prohibiting those subsidies. This is about freeing up billions of dollars. So if 22 of those $1 billion are considered harmful, are going to be prohibited in let's say, if the agreement is implemented the way it's supposed to be implemented, then it's freeing up all that money to be granted into sustainable subsidies, sustainable fishing subsidies. So whether to improve or strengthen the traditional ocean economic activities, to develop emerging industries. I mean, I think the sky is the limit. But the point is, we're freeing up a lot of billions of dollars used on harmful fishing subsidies. And now those billions of dollars can become very good, positive subsidies for the fishing sector. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I'll yield the floor now to Say, but of course, at the end of Say's presentation, we'll be very happy to answer any questions around the process and the substance.
Thank you, Santiago. And I guess my task here is just to give you a quick overview of the agreement and the next steps in terms of what members need to do to implement the agreement. And I'm sure that all of you have read the agreement in full detail, so my job should be very easy. So first, just in terms of the scope of the agreement, what are we talking about? What does this agreement cover? So we call it the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies. But as Santiago mentioned in the beginning, that this stems really from the subsidies, and the subsidies are something that are already defined within the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. They have to, as with the Agreement of Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, be specific to the fishing sector. And in terms of coverage, then we're also looking at wild marine capture fishing and fishing-related activities that take place at the sea. So that means that this does not include aquaculture, nor does it include inland fishing or onshore fishing. So in this slide, this slide will just give you an overview of what the main disciplines are. So in general, we have three main disciplines within the agreement. The first being subsidies to IUU fishing, and the essential part of this is that the subsidies to IUU fishing would be prohibited if a determination has been made by a number of actors that IUU fishing is taking place. So, I mean, not to overcomplicate things, but there's certain actors that have jurisdiction on certain parts of the waters that can make IUU determinations. For example, as a coastal state, which most blue economies are, you are responsible for making IUU determinations within your exclusive economic zone that is 200 nautical miles from your coast. And once an IUU determination is made and is notified to the WTO through the notifications that are submitted to the committee, then members that are subsidizing vessels that have been identified by your authorities as engaged in IUU fishing should remove that subsidy. Of course, there's a lot of due process requirements in terms of procedural requirements in terms of ensuring that the procedures are followed in a way that are fair and transparent across the different members and the different vessels and operators. But essentially, that's what that prohibition covers. Second is the subsidies to overfish stocks. So here is that if a stock is determined as being overfished and this is a very fisheries management term. Essentially what it is that if there's some sort of a determination, whether it's purely science-based or some other reference point, some traditional methods that can determine that, let's say, a specific species in your waters is overfished, then no subsidy should be provided to fish those stocks. Of course, there's a caveat for this, and that is that members shall be allowed to continue to provide subsidies if the subsidies themselves are designed to rebuild the stock, so kind of a positive subsidy, or if we have or if they have other measures in place that would offset some of the negative impacts of such subsidies. And finally, we have a provision on fishing in the unregulated high seas. And this is a straight prohibition with no conditionality that no fishing in the high seas should be subsidized by any member for any vessel or operator. So those are the three prohibitions. And we do have other disciplines within the text that that members should take special care and due restraint for, and that is for vessels that are not flying the flag of the vessel. We call it reflagging in WTO, but essentially if a subsidizing member should not subsidize a vessel that is not carrying its own flag. Well, it's not a prohibition, but there should be special care and due restraint for those kind of subsidies. And finally, also, there should be special care and due restraint for subsidies to fishing unassessed stocks. So we know that a lot of stocks are unassessed, and members would not want to have a prohibition on those stocks until at a time when capacity is built to be able to assess the status of those stocks. One broad exception, particularly for which has been quite important for members that are from blue economy regions, is an exception for disaster relief, because there's a lot of natural disasters that do happen around those economies, and that is that for the purposes of disaster relief, a member is exempt from these prohibitions. There are also some other exceptions. Of course, as with all other WTO agreements, we do have the rules and then we do have the exceptions. So another one is with regards to special and differential treatment for developing countries and least developed countries. The first one being a due restraint for least developed countries. And for this one, it's basically that members have to exercise special care and due restraint on how they, on the dispute settlement mechanism in terms of taking disputes to LDC on the actions of LDCs at the WTO, just because of their capacity constraints. Also, there is targeted technical assistance and capacity building. This includes the Fish Fund, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And on notification requirements, there's also a flexibility for certain members that are below a threshold of fishing. I think the number that we have is 0.7% or 0.8? 0.8%. Yes, a lot had happened during MC12. 0.8%, I believe, is the number. And as well as least developed countries, where rather than meeting the every 2-year requirement of providing notifications, it will be for every 4 years. So the one special, I guess, compared to, as Santiago mentioned, we do have regional initiatives on fishery subsidies. So what sets us apart is not just in terms of our geographic scope, that we have much more of the membership, but also the enforceability of these rules. We have the WTO dispute settlement system. So that means that if there's lack of compliance to the rules, there is discourse for members to take to bring to the dispute settlement, making it a much more enforceable instrument. However, also we do have this termination clause, as we call it, the sunset clause that Santiago did mention earlier. And that is that one of the products from MC12 is that after 4 years of entry into force of this agreement, that if the new additional disciplines were not concluded and members were not able to come to an agreement, then the agreement could terminate within 4 years. However, you shouldn't look at this as a big warning, rather as an opportunity, because it really incentivizes members to engage in improving on, or to add additional disciplines to the agreement to ensure that they are more comprehensive than they already are. And finally, also, there is in the area of special and differential treatment for the two provisions, we have 2-year peace clauses for least developed countries and developing countries, which means that they will not be subject to dispute settlement for 2 years after entry into force of the agreement. There are a number of cross-cutting issues. I'll go into them very briefly. There's more detail in the slides, but because I know that we're running out of time, I'll go into them briefly, and then you can always refer back to the slides or come back to us with any questions. So one of them is on institutional arrangements, and the other one on notification and transparency, and then technical assistance and capacity building. And you'll see the slides as we go forward. So on the technical assistance and capacity building, yes?
I don't want to interrupt, but just because this question relates to something very specific that you said, one of the participants from the ComSec, Salamat Ali, wants to understand a little bit the rationale behind the sunset clause.
The rationale behind the sunset clause. Okay, so before I go into how it would operate, perhaps Santiago can go into how we got there, because it happened in the midst of the ministerial conference, and he was right in the thick of things.
Right, yeah, and very quickly, not to interrupt more of Safe's presentation, but so the sunset clause was there because in the middle of the ministerial, we had the W20 text that I mentioned before, and through the ministerial, that was distilled and distilled further. And at the end, the rationale of ministers was, let's look at the disciplines that we all agree in, because there were some elements that there was no consensus around those elements. So they said, let's put those apart for a while, and let's agree on what we have. And it's already a pretty ambitious, pretty substantive agreement. So we said, let's do that. But there were some members that said, wait a minute, but we care about these other issues, not necessarily the exact text, but the issues. And we don't want to have a mandate that is open-ended without any incentive to actually negotiate on. So they said, we need something that would force us members to keep negotiating on those outstanding issues. So initially, the idea of those members was, the agreement will never enter into force unless we agree on these other disciplines. That evolved into what we now have, the sunset clause. So the agreement will enter into force, but after 4 years after the entry into force, if the new disciplines are not agreed yet, the agreement would terminate unless there's a decision by the General Council saying otherwise or extending the deadline. So that's more or less how things got from nothing to the sunset clause.
Was that clear?
Yes, thank you. And just so that you don't feel too much pressure, we have until midday, we have until noon, and it's just the two of you. So if you need to slow down or you don't feel too rushed, you have a little bit of time for the presentation.
Okay, thank you. And I don't know what noon is in Geneva.
Oh, in half an hour's time.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. But we do want to leave some time for question and answers, or if, as you did right now, Janive, if there's any questions in between, just feel free to interrupt us as well.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the fish fund. So basically, Article 7 of the agreement envisages that developing countries and least developed countries would require some form of technical assistance and capacity building to implement these agreements. Just as Santiago mentioned earlier, there's going to be a lot of implementation challenges, and it's a very technical area, and surveillance would be quite costly and burdensome for a lot of countries. So within that Article 7 on technical assistance, there was also the idea to create a voluntary WTO funding mechanism, which we call the Fish Fund, with a view of assisting developing countries and LDCs with three main work areas. The first one being to integrate fisheries sustainability elements into their fisheries subsidies policies. The second is to strengthen sustainable fisheries management system. And finally, to comply with notification and transparency obligations at the WTO. So basically addressing the three main challenges that had been identified in Santiago's presentation earlier. So in terms of also operating this fund, It will be mainly operated within the WTO. It would be a separate fund, just as if any of you are familiar with the Trade Facilitation Fund or the STDF, which works on SPS issues. So it will be a similar kind of setup, but with some of our main partners, including the Food and Agriculture Organization and IFAD. So the idea is basically to integrate both the subsidies policy and the fishery sustainability side into one mechanism, and also to help leverage other support that could be found within other institutions, whether it's bilateral or multilaterally. So what else comes next? So mine is what is the first work stream that we just discussed, which is the additional negotiations. We do have work that happens when it comes to implementation. So first and foremost, and most importantly, is that the agreement would be just as effective as its implementation. And for it to actually be implementable, it would have to enter into force. And entry into force in the WTO means 2/3 of the membership have to deposit their instrument of acceptance to the WTO. So that's first and foremost priority. Then once it has entered into force, then the motions for implementation set. So first, a committee on fishery subsidies will be established at the WTO and would be reporting through the Council on Trade in Goods. And within this committee, all implementation related activities will take place. So in terms of notifications of fisheries related information, but also the sharing of best practices and so on. There's a lot of work, particularly in the WTO, that happens within the committee with regards to implementation that doesn't make it all the way to dispute settlement. And this is why it's so important to have the committee work, because it acts as a buffer before members actually get into possible recourse in terms of compliance. Also within the institutional arrangements, the agreement envisages a review of the agreement 5 years after entry into force. This is different from the sunset termination clause that we have. This was drafted with the idea that members would want to ensure that they are keeping track of the progress of the agreement, the effectiveness of the agreement, and making recommendations to improve the agreement if needed in the future, once there's more information on fish stocks, on subsidies, and the impacts that these subsidies have on fish stocks as well. So just this is just a slide to illustrate what members are expected to do with regards to their acceptance of the agreement. The WTO Secretariat has been consulting members, advising members on how best to take this process forward. We call it acceptance because we know that in different jurisdictions, it means different things. So for example, for some members, it's as simple as a decree from an executive order, whereas for others, it's a bit more complicated. You'd have to go through Parliament, and there may be several sittings, and you have to look cross-cuttingly across different policy instruments. So really depending on the jurisdiction, you can find different examples. What we do know is that we know that many members have already started this process, and some have also signaled that they are looking to deposit their instrument by the end of this year. So that is very encouraging. Our Director General is challenging members to have the agreement enter into force in what the last, I think she said, was less than 9 months. Yeah. Very ambitious, but we remain optimistic. So let's see how that goes. And I jumped a little quickly. So my last 2 slides. So we spoke about the committee, the review mechanism, and also our close contact with other international organizations, just because the WTO is not a fisheries management organization, and nor are the the delegates that deal with WTO issues. So there's a recognition that there's a need for more collaboration, particularly with those organizations that do work in the fisheries management area, since a lot of the disciplines do have fisheries management related elements. So FAO was identified as one of those relevant in our organization, but also regional fisheries management organizations and associations. Finally, also just to briefly say about transparency and notification. So once the agreement enters into force, there'll be notification obligations for all members that are subsidizing. And I'm not subsidizing, because if you're not subsidizing, you're still required within the WTO to provide what we call a nil notification. So already upon entry into force, members should notify their membership to any regional fisheries management organization at the WTO. We must note here that you're still obliged as a member to provide your notifications under the agreement of subsidies and countervailing measures. And whatever you're doing for the fisheries agreement is just in addition to that. So whatever I talk about here is what you will add to your notification on the ASCM. So the first one, as I mentioned, is membership to RFMOs or A's. And then within 1 year, all members should submit information on the measures concerning implementation and administration of the agreement and descriptions of their fisheries regime. Annually, after that, the members should provide list of vessels and operators that they determine to have engaged in IUU fishing. And this is, of course, it's presumed that members would provide this information as the IUU determinations have been made. So, it's up to the member to decide whether they do it on the spot or at one time, once a year. And finally, every 2 years, along with your subsidies notifications under the ASCM, you're also required to provide the types of fishing activities for which you're providing subsidies to, and to the extent possible, some other fisheries management related information, such as the status of the fish stocks and the management measures, the fleet capacities, and the vessel names. These are all to the extent possible, because we know that it's quite challenging for a lot of members and quite burdensome. And also, this is why for developing members and LDCs that are below 0.8%, this information is only required every 4 years, because there is an understanding that this is quite burdensome information to provide quite often on a regular basis. And of course, that's why we also emphasize the need for technical assistance and capacity building. So that is it in terms of the disciplines in general. We hope that we were comprehensive enough, both in terms of the process and the substance. And as Santiago said, we have the disciplines. They are comprehensive, but members do recognize that there are some outstanding issues. So we have one work stream, which is the implementation side of what already exists, and the other work stream, which is the second wave of negotiations. And we will be kicking off the second wave of negotiations next week with a retreat of all WTO members, where members are expected to brainstorm on exactly how they envisage this next wave of negotiations to go, both in terms of process and in terms of substance. So following the ministerial mandate to have these additional disciplines negotiated and possible recommendations by MC13, it doesn't leave us much time, probably a year and a few months, give or take. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So I'll stop there. Santiago, if you have anything else to add, otherwise we give the floor back to you, Janive, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.